It was the spring of 1887, when the cottonwoods along El Dorado Creek were just leafing out, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains still wore a crown of snow. I saw her step down at dusk, boots sinking a thumb deep into the red dust like she meant to root there. The wagon rolled off, leaving only wind and the rattle of cottonwoods along the water. May Callahan set a battered carpetbag on the porch rail of the Boone place and squared her shoulders at the mountains, peaks burning with the last light against a sky fading to copper. 6 small pairs of shoes cluttered the doorway. A 7th, larger pair waited on the top step, scuffed and stubborn. Inside, the house breathed in hush. Cold iron, old coffee, a skillet scar, a table nicked by years of elbows. May moved through it like a careful hand over a fresh bruise. Water first, fire next, bread after. The eldest, June, watched from the stire's shadow, jaw held like a gate that wouldn't open. The littlest, Annie Lou, drifted near, fingers finding the hem of a stranger's dress, then letting go. No words needed. A pot rose to a low song. Somewhere, a hinge confessed its loneliness. Elias Boone stood in the doorway, hat in hand, not claiming or refusing, just measuring weather. The creek kept talking, steady as breath. I marked the way May's eyes mapped every broken thing, as if counting was a kind of prayer. By full dark, the house smelled like staying. The first wind came low, like a wagon crossing far-off plains. By the time it reached the Boone place, it had picked up the smell of river mud and sage, carrying with it the kind of cold that seeps through wood and skin alike. Inside, the stove whispered in quiet pops. May had the pot going, something thick with beef and root vegetables, the scent stretching into every rafter. But the house stayed silent in a way that pressed on the eardrums. June sat at the table, not to eat, but to sharpen a pencil down to a stub. The shavings curled on the wood, tight spirals that she brushed away without looking up. Annie Lou was cross-legged on the floor, turning the hem of her dress between thumb and finger, watching the flames like they might explain something. The other girls, Daisy Jo, the twins, and little Maribel, hovered in the parlor doorway, half shadows, half curiosity. Elias was on the porch. His boots made no sound. He could stand there for hours, as still as the fence posts in the moonlight. May could feel the distance between them like an unbroken line of barbed wire. Too high to climb, too deep to crawl under. The wind rose, whistling through the eaves, and somewhere out back a shutter banged once, twice. One of the twins startled, a quick, sharp intake of breath. May didn't look up from slicing bread. She'd lived through worse nights, nights when wind was only a prelude to bad news. She kept her hand steady, each slice falling in even measure. By supper, the bread was warm and the stew ready, but no one moved toward the table until Elias stepped in, dust shaken from his coat. He said nothing, just hung it by the door and sat. The girls took their places in a slow, uncertain tide. June slid into her chair without lifting her eyes. Annie Lou needed guiding by the shoulder. May served without fuss, ladling the stew, setting down the bread, pouring water into tin cups. They ate with the sound of wind as the only conversation, forks against plates, the sigh of the fire. Elias's chair creaked when he shifted. May kept her eyes on her own bowl, but she was counting in her head. The minutes between each girl's bite, the way Daisy Jo's hand hovered before taking another piece of bread, the tight line of June's shoulders. When it was done, May cleared the dishes, stacking them in the wash basin. The girls scattered, some to the loft, some to the shadows beyond the stairs. Elias returned to the porch. The house breathed in again, the long inhale before night settles fully. May washed up in the glow of a single lamp, the water turning cloudy with soap and the day's work. She was almost done when the first soft sound came, a bare foot on the plank floor, quick, hesitant. She didn't turn. Another step, closer now. A pause. "Storm's comin'," said a small voice behind her. She glanced over her shoulder. Annie Lou stood there with a quilt clutched to her chest, eyes too wide for her face. May dried her hands on her apron, nodded, toward the back room. The girl followed, climbing onto the narrow cot without a word. May tucked the quilt around her and sat on the edge, listening to the wind slide around the house. Not long after, another sound, the floorboard near the pantry, then the shuffle of bare feet. Daisy Jo appeared, hair loose, carrying a ragged pillow. She didn't ask, just crawled up beside Annie Lou. Then one of the twins came, and then the other. June was last, lingering in the doorway, half in shadow. Her arms were crossed, but her bare feet betrayed her. The floorboards beneath them creaked in a slow surrender. She stepped inside, sat on the floor against the wall. May didn't speak. She didn't need to. The room was small, but the air in it changed, less tight, less cold. Outside, the wind kept to its own business, rattling the barn, moving through the cottonwoods like it had somewhere else to be. One by one, their breathing evened. Annie Lou's small hand found May's skirt. Daisy Jo shifted closer until her head rested on May's leg. The twins curled like pups in the corner. June kept her eyes open the longest, watching May in the lamplight as though waiting for proof that she wouldn't vanish. May stayed still, her back against the wall, her own eyes half closed. She could feel the old ache in her bones, the one that came from years of being no one's first choice, softening just enough to let something else in. It wasn't comfort exactly, more like the recognition of a door she hadn't known was still there. By the time the lamp burned low, all 6 girls were asleep, their small breaths filling the room like a tide. May kept watch, and though the wind still prowled around the Boone place, it didn't sound so sharp now. Somewhere out on the porch, Elias's boots shifted once, then went still again. When the first light touched the window, May realized she'd slept too, her head tilted, her arms draped over the children like a canopy. She hadn't done that in years. Outside, the wind had gone quiet, and the cottonwoods along El Dorado Creek were still. The storm came up from the south with no warning, a dark bruise swelling across the horizon. By mid-afternoon, the light had gone the color of tarnished brass, and the smell of rain sat heavy in the air. Elias was already outside, shoulders set against the wind, tightening the lines on the corral. May stood in the kitchen doorway, apron pressed to her knees, watching the sky pull itself into knots. Out past the barn, the fence along the west pasture was already leaning, the posts tilting like tired men after a long ride. Elias cursed under his breath and kept hammering. The wind plucked at his hat brim, snapped at his coat. Dust rose in red sheets from the earth, twisting into the air before the first drops fell. May didn't think. She grabbed the hammer from the tool shelf, strode out into the teeth of the wind. The rain stung her cheeks. Her skirts tangled around her legs. Elias saw her coming and shook his head, but she was already dropping to one knee beside the broken post. They worked without words, he holding the wire taut, she driving nails into the grain, each strike ringing sharp in the charged air. The clouds pressed low, their bellies torn by jagged veins of lightning. The smell of ozone mixed with the sweet rot scent of wet sagebrush. May's hands throbbed with each blow, but she didn't stop. The last post went in just as the rain began to come sideways, a curtain driven by the wind. May pushed the hammer into Elias's palm, but he didn't take it. His eyes were on the house, where the porch light flickered and shadows crowded the rail. It was Annie Lou's voice that carried across the distance, thin, high, cutting through the storm like a bird's cry. "You fixed our fence. Can you fix Mama's heart too?" May froze. The rain slid cold down her neck, but the heat that rose in her chest was worse. Elias's shoulders went rigid. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved, the words hanging between them like a rope pulled taut. The wind grabbed the moment, tried to scatter it, but it clung there all the same. May bent, picked up the hammer where it had dropped into the mud. She pressed it into Elias's hand this time, until his fingers closed around it. "I'll get supper started," she said, not looking at him. She turned toward the house, the rain soaking her through before she'd crossed half the yard. The girls swarmed her at the steps, June with a towel, Daisy Joe tugging at her arm, the twins darting in to grab her skirts. They chattered over each other, voices high with a mixture of worry and relief. May let them pull her inside, let them circle her like a herd against a predator. She dried her hair by the hearth, the heat biting at her damp skin. One of the twins pressed a mug of tea into her hand. The steam curled into her face, carrying the wild honey scent she'd started using for the little ones' drinks. She didn't realize, until she sat down, that the girls had formed a loose ring around her. One perched on the arm of the chair, another sprawled on the rug, Daisy Joe kneeling by her knee, June in the doorway, arms crossed but eyes softer than before. "You didn't even flinch when she said that," June said after a moment, her voice low but steady. May met her gaze. "I heard. She says things like that sometimes. Mama stuff. It hurts." May's fingers tightened around the mug. "Yes," she said quietly. "It does." June shifted, uncrossing her arms. "You gonna stay?" The question didn't come like a challenge. It came tired, older than a girl of 12 should sound. May let the silence stretch, the fire popping in the grate, the storm drumming on the roof. "I don't plan to leave," she said finally. June nodded once, slow. "Good. We're tired of women who leave." The door creaked then, letting in a breath of cold air and the smell of wet earth. Elias stepped inside, water streaming from his coat, his hat in his hand. His eyes swept the room, over May, over the girls, and for the first time since she'd met him, his shoulders didn't look so burdened. "Storm's not done," he said, "but the fence will hold." May rose, set her mug aside. "Supper in 10. He nodded, brushing water from his sleeves, and disappeared into his room without another word. That night, the wind howled down the chimney, and the thunder cracked like a tree splitting. One of the twins screamed from the loft, and May was already on the ladder before Elias's boots hit the floor. She gathered the child in her arms, murmuring, "It's just the sky stomping its boots." "Is it mad?" the girl whimpered. "No, sweetheart. Loud doesn't mean angry." The others stirred, and soon they were all huddled around her on the loft floor, the storm outside and a steadier storm settling inside her. One that felt less like destruction and more like a strange, unasked-for renewal. From below, she heard Elias's footsteps pause, then fade toward the porch. He didn't join them, but she didn't mind. Some storms, she thought, you weather alone. Others you weather by being exactly where someone expects to find you. When the wind finally dropped near dawn, May lay awake between the slow breaths of the girls, staring into the dim rafters. The fence was fixed, yes. But there were other breaks here, splintered places invisible to the eye, holding more weight than any post and wire could bear. And whether she'd meant to or not, she was already part of the work to mend them. The first frost had barely left its mark when the sickness came, slipping into the Boone place on a breath of cold air and settling heavy in Daisy Joe's chest. At first it was just a cough, dry and nagging, the kind that might have passed in a day or two. But by nightfall, her forehead burned hot enough to make May's stomach twist. The house was quiet except for that cough. Sharp, tearing, followed by the small sound of a girl trying not to cry. May moved like she'd been here before, because she had. Water on the boil. Clean cloths by the bed. the smell of crushed willow bark steeping dark in a mug. She sent the twins to fetch more wood, Annie Lou to sit by the kettle, June to keep the little ones from crowding. Her voice stayed steady, but every order was clipped, precise. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, rattling the shutters like a restless rider tapping spurs. Elias came in from the barn, his coat damp at the shoulders, and saw the lamp burning in the back room. He read the truth in May's face before she said it. Santa Rosa's doctor, was all she told him. He nodded once, already reaching for his coat. As he pulled on his gloves, he glanced back at the bed, then at her. Wind's biting hard out there, but it ain't got nothing on this fever. By the time his horse's hooves faded into the cold, Daisy Joe's breathing had gone ragged. May propped her upright, an arm firm around narrow shoulders, spooning broth between lips that barely stirred. The heat coming off the child was like standing too close to a forge. May's own mind kept skittering toward another bed, another fever years ago, one she hadn't been able to turn back. She pushed the thought down hard, the way you'd shove a door against the wind. The hours folded over themselves. Steam rose from the kettle. The room smelled of damp wool and honey. The girls drifted in and out of the doorway, their eyes too large for their faces. June stood with her back to the wall, white-knuckled hands gripping the edge of her skirt. May met her gaze once, long enough to pass something silent between them, an agreement, a promise. When Elias returned, he brought more than the doctor. He brought the bite of cold air and the sound of boots quick on wood. The doctor's bag opened with a snap, the bitter scent of tinctures cutting through the room. May stepped aside only enough for him to work, but kept her hand at Daisy Joe's back the whole time. Outside, the wind dropped to a whisper, as if even the weather was listening in. It was 4 days before the fever broke. 4 days of watching the slow rise and fall of a small chest, of wringing cloths into the basin until her fingers went raw. On the morning, Daisy Joe opened her eyes and whispered, "Mama." May's knees nearly gave way. She bent close, smoothing damp hair from the girl's temple, and said the only thing that mattered. "I'm here." Elias had been standing in the doorway, silent. He shifted his weight, eyes on the child, then on May. "Out here, you don't get to choose who you ride for. Sometimes the trail chooses for you." May didn't answer, but the truth of it rooted deep. That night, the Boone girls didn't scatter to the loft after supper. They gathered close instead, on the rug, against the chair, leaning into her sides like she was some anchor they'd been drifting toward without realizing it. Even Elias lingered longer than usual by the fire, his hands idle for once, his eyes softer in the flicker of the lamplight. May didn't call attention to it. She only sat still, feeling the weight of their trust settle over her shoulders like a blanket. The fire snapped, the wind eased, and somewhere deep inside, something that had been locked away for years shifted and stayed open. It was the kind of day when the sun seemed to burn through every color. Gold on the cottonwoods, silver on the creek, red dust rising lazy from the road. May was hanging laundry, her fingers stiff from the chill, when she caught movement down near the fence line. A rider, thin as a fence post himself, was coming slow, hat tipped back, the brim shadowing a grin too wide for a stranger. He rode up without hurry, swung down from his horse like the ground was his to take, and tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, but his eyes wandered too long over the shape of her shoulders, the curve of her arms. May didn't move from the wash line. "You're far from town," she said, voice flat. "Just passin' through," he drawled, brushing dust from his coat. "Heard tell there's a widow up this way, cookin' for a lone man and a parcel of young'uns. Thought maybe she could use a hand, or some company." His grin widened, but there was nothing kind in it. Before May could answer, the porch board spoke, one slow creak, then another. Elias Boone stepped into the light, big as the cottonwoods behind him, his hat pulled low, his shadow falling over both of them. He didn't speak right away, and somehow that was worse than shouting. "You heard wrong," Elias said finally. The man's smirk faltered. "She's not a widow cookin' for hire. She's family." Elias didn't raise his voice, but the air between them tightened. The rider raised both hands in a half-mockery of surrender. "No offense meant." "Then keep ridin'." The man backed toward his horse, trying for a laugh that came out brittle. A moment later, the red dust took him, the clop of hooves fading toward the horizon. May stood still, the wind tugging at the sheets on the line. Elias glanced at her once, nodded, and went back inside without another word. She followed later, setting an extra folded napkin beside his plate at supper. He didn't look up, but she caught the near-silent "thank you" before it disappeared into the sound of cutlery. 2 days later, the second visitor came, this one from the far hills, on a horse the color of winter mud. May knew him the moment he swung down. Caleb Dusty McGraw, the man folks in El Dorado Creek spoke of in half-remembered stories. He and Elias had ridden together years back, before Dusty took to drifting. Some said he'd seen more gun smoke than daylight. Others said he'd been running from something that didn't have a face. He came with the easy way of a man who never asked permission to stand where he stood. His eyes swept the yard, the barn, the line of fence posts, and finally landed on May with a nod more respectful than words. "Ma'am?" Elias met him halfway to the porch, their handshake a slow, measuring thing. "Fence on your north side saggin'," Dusty said, as if he'd just noticed a change in the weather. "Coyotes have been running close." May saw Elias's jaw work, the way his gaze flicked toward the barn. "I've got it handled." "Maybe," Dusty said. "But another set of hands don't hurt when teeth come in the night." That evening, just past sunset, the dogs started up, a wild, ragged chorus from the far side of the corral. May stepped out in time to see shadows moving low and fast along the fence line. The sheep bunched in the corner, their eyes flashing in the lantern light. Elias was already crossing the yard when Dusty appeared from the dark, rifle in hand, moving with the unhurried stride of a man who knew exactly how far trouble was and how long it would take to meet it. A single shot cracked the air, not to kill but to warn, and the shadows scattered into the brush, their yips fading into the cold. May's breath came slow again, her heart easing as the night went still. Dusty lowered the rifle, eyes on the horizon. "Fence won't hold 'em off forever," he said. "We'll fix it tomorrow," Elias replied. May stood there, the lantern light warm on her hands, thinking of the uninvited guest from days before, of coyotes and men who circled places they didn't belong. Dusty caught her eye then, and there was something in his look. Not a question, not a warning, but the quiet acknowledgement between those who had seen enough to know danger came in more than one shape. Later, in the kitchen, May poured coffee into 3 mugs. Elias and Dusty sat at the table, the talk low and easy, the kind that ran under the surface like the creek after rain. She didn't join in, just listened, the warmth of the stove at her back, the sound of 2 men who had once faced storms together and might again. When Dusty left the next morning, he didn't say goodbye, only tipped his hat to her with that same respectful nod. "Coyotes'll be back," he said. "So will I." She watched him ride out, the sun just cresting the hills, throwing long shadows across the Boone place. The sheets on the line snapped in the breeze, white against the wide blue. Somewhere in that wind, May felt the shift. A small one, but certain. The Boone place was no longer just Elias's burden, or the girl's shelter, or her job. It was a place being watched over, in more ways than one. And she, somehow, was part of the reason worth watching. The morning the letter came, the Boone place was quiet enough to hear the creek tapping over stones. May found it tucked under a coil of twine on the porch rail, The paper worn soft from travel, her name written in a hand she hadn't seen in years. She didn't open it right away, just stood with the sun on her face, the paper warm in her palm. Inside, the girls were chasing the last chill out of the house. Annie Lou feeding kindling to the stove, Daisy Joe banging a wooden spoon against the table, the twins arguing over a scarf. May slipped the letter into her apron pocket and went to knead bread, the smell of yeast rising slow as the day. It wasn't until the dough was set to rest and the girls had scattered to their chores that she read it. The handwriting was neater than she remembered, the words clipped but heavy. May, it's been a long trail since we spoke. Maybe too long. Thought it might be time we set old things aside. There's room here if you'd come. Sam, her late husband's brother. The man who'd stayed gone through all the grief, all the lean years. Now suddenly his door was open. By evening the letter had become a stone in her pocket. Elias noticed. He always did. They were sitting by the fire after the girls had gone to bed, the logs collapsing in a slow sigh. "You seem far off," he said, his voice more observation than question. "Got a letter," May answered, staring into the embers. "Bad news?" "Just old news, dressed up like something new." Elias leaned back in his chair, the lamplight catching in his eyes. "You thinking of going?" She shook her head, but not quick enough to hide the hesitation. "I don't know." "Then tell me when you do." The next day, clouds stacked on the horizon, dark and swollen. By afternoon, the wind was coming hard off the hills, bending the cottonwoods and sending the chickens into the coop. May was gathering the wash when Elias's voice carried across the yard. "Storm's riding in fast." It hit before they could secure the barn. The doors slammed open, wind screaming through the rafters. Elias grabbed a length of rope, but May was right behind him, skirts whipping around her legs. "I can handle it," he shouted over the gale. "I know you can," she shouted back, "but it'll go faster with two." They fought the wind together, shoving the doors into place, the rope burning their palms as they tied it off. Rain hit next, sharp, needling, stinging their faces. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. When it was done, they leaned against the barn wall, catching their breath. May's hair was plastered to her cheeks, water running from her sleeves. Elias reached out, almost without thinking, and brushed a strand back. His hand lingered for a heartbeat, the calluses rough against her skin. "Stay," he said simply. The word cut through the roar of the storm, clear as a rifle shot. May met his eyes, rain dripping from her lashes. "You, sure you want me to?" Elias's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. "Only thing I've been sure of in years." They walked back to the house side by side, not speaking, the kind of silence that held more than words. Inside, the girls were huddled near the hearth, eyes wide, relief spilling into chatter as soon as they saw them. May shrugged off her coat, the heat of the fire chasing the chill from her bones. Later that night, after the storm eased and the girls were asleep, May took the letter from her pocket and set it in the fire. The paper curled, blackened, the words lifting away in thin, twisting smoke. She didn't watch it burn all the way down, just enough to know it wouldn't be waiting in the morning. Outside, the land was washed clean. The fence held, the barn stood, and in the distance the creek sang louder than before. The next morning, Elias poured her coffee before pouring his own. "Trail's long, May," he said, that slow cowboy drawl in his voice. "But some stops are worth more than the miles it took to get there." May looked at him over the rim of her cup. "And some miles ain't worth riding if they take you away from what matters." He nodded, the faintest glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Neither of them said it, but they both knew. The choice had already been made. That week, she found herself moving through the Boone place differently. Mending clothes without being asked. Checking the fence line in the mornings. teaching Daisy Joe a new bread recipe. It wasn't obligation. It was something steadier, a kind of claim she hadn't made anywhere in years. Elias didn't comment, but she caught the way his gaze lingered when he came in from the fields, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. Dusty rode by once during that stretch, just long enough to remark, "Place feels more lived in than it used to." May only smiled. "Maybe it is." He tipped his hat. "Then you're doing it right." When he left, the air seemed to hold the echo of his words, the truth of them settling over her like the slow warmth of a sunlit afternoon. She was here now, rooted, as sure as the cottonwoods along El Dorado Creek. And for the first time in a long while, she had no urge to move on. The cottonwoods along the Pecos River had just begun to leaf, their branches trembling in the spring wind, when Elias asked her. No big speeches, no ring at first, just the two of them standing in the garden, hands deep in the soil. He straightened up, brushing dirt from his palms, and said, "Figure we've both been circling the same fire long enough. Might as well call it home for good." May laughed, short, surprised, but she didn't look away. "Is that your way of proposing?" "It's the only way I know." They married under the tallest cottonwood, the white bark shining in the morning sun. The preacher from El Dorado Creek stood with a worn Bible, and Dusty acted as witness, leaning on his saddle horn, like he'd known all along it would end this way. The girls wore dresses May had stitched from scraps of calico and old curtains, each with a ribbon in her hair. There were no other guests, none needed. The vows were spoken low, meant for their ears alone, the words carried off by the river. Elias slipped a silver ring onto her finger, not new but polished bright, and kissed her like he was sealing a promise he intended to keep. That evening, the Boone table felt different, not louder, just fuller. May caught herself smiling at the way the girls moved around her, handing dishes, pouring coffee for Elias, chattering about small things as if the world outside the ranch didn't exist. But the world outside didn't stay away for long. 2 days later, a knock came at the door, hard, businesslike. Sheriff Kavanaugh stood there, hat in hand, his eyes carrying a weight May didn't like. "Elias," he said, "you've been named in a claim." Elias frowned. "Over what?" "Land." The sheriff's gaze flicked toward May, then back. "Martin Harper, your late wife's cousin, says this place was deeded wrong. Claims your wife inherited it, and it should have passed to her kin." The air seemed to thin. May could feel the girls behind her in the hallway, holding their breath. Elias's voice came slow, measured. "This land's been mine since I was 17. Martin's got papers, a lawyer out of Santa Fe. I'd get one of your own." The weeks that followed bent time. Elias was in town most days, riding hard to meet with an old friend who knew the law. May kept the place running, feeding the stock, tending the garden, keeping the girls' worries from spilling over. But at night, when the wind was quiet, she could feel the tension in the walls, in the silence of the house. One afternoon, while clearing out an old drawer for documents, Elias found a letter. Unopened, the paper yellowed at the edges. He brought it to her in the kitchen, his face unreadable. "It's from Ruth," he said. She took it carefully, broke the seal. The words inside were steady, deliberate. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. The land was always yours, Elias. I never wanted anyone else to lay claim to it. I don't trust my cousin Martin. I reckon he'd come sniffing. So I'm signing this to put it in writing. This is yours for the girls to grow up on, for you to keep, and maybe someday you won't be alone out here. I hope someone good finds you." It was signed, dated, witnessed by a neighbor in the valley. May pressed the paper to her chest, the relief sharp enough to sting. This saves everything. And it did. Elias's lawyer confirmed it. The claim collapsed in days, Martin leaving town with nothing but his grumbling. That night, the Boone place felt like it could breathe again. The girls laughed over supper without checking Elias's face first. Daisy Joe hummed while drying dishes. May sat back in her chair, letting the warmth of the room sink in. Elias caught her eye from across the table. "Looks like this place holds after all," he said. May smiled. It was never just the place. He nodded once, as if he understood exactly what she meant. From then on, May's work shifted. She started a ledger in the back of her recipe book, tracking every dollar, every jar of preserves sold at the market in Santa Rosa, every egg traded for sugar or coffee. Elias noticed, and one evening on the porch he said, "You thinking we might have to fight again?" "I'm thinking I'd like to be ready if we do." 2 days later, he built her a bigger pantry and a new chicken coop, without saying another word. The Boone place began to grow in ways that weren't just about survival. Flowers in the yard, extra rows of vegetables in the garden, a new swing for Annie Lou hung from the cottonwood. Dusty came by with fence posts and a knowing grin. "Reckon this is what staying put looks like," he said. May laughed. "Reckon it is." The river kept running. The cottonwoods whispered. And for the first time in many seasons, May believed they might have more years here than they could count. Your turn. If you were in May's place, offered a chance to leave, but finding a home worth fighting for, would you stay? Type yes or no in the comments. The evening had come down slow, laying long shadows across the Boone place. May was shelling peas by the lamplight, the girls' laughter drifting in from the yard like wind-borne music. It was the kind of quiet you don't take for granted out here. Quiet that sits deep. Not just the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. Then the knock came. It wasn't polite. It was the kind of knock that didn't wait for welcome. A fist hitting wood in a steady, claiming rhythm. The peas rolled from May's fingers and scattered over the table. Outside, the last of the daylight pooled on the horizon, copper bleeding into black. Elias stepped from the far room, wiping his hands on a rag. He gave May a look, one of those looks that was both question and answer, and moved to the door. When it swung open, the man standing there was tall, rangy, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Dust rode his coat and boots, and there was something in his stance that said he was used to stepping where he pleased. "Evenin'," the stranger said, eyes sliding past Elias and landing on May. "Heard tell a widow was cooking for a lonely rancher and a passel of girls. Thought maybe the lady could use an extra pair of hands." May's stomach tightened. She stepped up behind Elias, the lamplight catching in her hair. Elias didn't raise his voice, didn't even shift his stance, just let his gaze settle hard on the man. "Out here, a man's word rides further than his horse. Best you remember that." The stranger's smirk faltered, just a twitch, but he stayed where he was. May stepped into the doorway beside Elias, her voice low but clear. "Step careful, stranger. This house don't take kindly to trouble in its shadow." It was like the air itself leaned forward to listen. The man's grin cracked under the weight of the silence that followed. He tipped his hat, mockery or concession, it was hard to tell, and stepped back into the dusk. "Didn't mean no offense," he muttered, and walked off into the fading light. The door closed with a quiet finality. Elias stood there for a long beat, then turned toward May. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, though her pulse was still running like a horse headed downhill. Later, when the girls were in bed, May sat by the hearth sewing, but the image of that man's eyes lingered. Out here, threats didn't always come in with guns blazing. Sometimes they tested the edges first, looking for weak spots. 2 days later, the unexpected came again. But this time, it wasn't a man on the porch. It was the weather. The storm rolled in from the west without warning. Wind tore across the valley, flattening grass and snapping branches. The sky turned a bruised green, clouds tumbling over each other like cattle in a stampede. The barn doors flew open with the first hard gust. May heard the bang from the kitchen and was already pulling her shawl around her shoulders when Elias shouted from the yard. He was running toward the barn with a length of rope in one hand, the wind trying to shove him back. May didn't stop to think. She ran after him, skirts whipping, grit stinging her eyes. Together, they wrestled the doors against the wind, the rope biting into their palms. Elias's hat tore off and vanished into the dark. The smell of rain and ozone filled the air. The knot held. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing hard, their faces inches apart, rain slick on their skin. "Let's get back inside," Elias said, voice rough. The house was a riot of noise, loose shutters banging, the younger girls crying upstairs. May moved from bed to bed, tucking blankets tight, murmuring over their fears. Daisy Jo clung to her uninjured arm like a lifeline. "Is the wind gonna take the roof, Mama?" she whispered. "Not while we're under it," May said, brushing damp hair from the girl's forehead. Hours passed before the storm eased. When it did, the house felt like it exhaled. The shutters stopped rattling. The rain softened. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote gave a lonely call. Elias came in from the porch, his shoulders no longer squared against the wind. He looked around at the room, at May, at the girls gathered close, and the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. The next morning, the air smelled scrubbed clean, the world washed fresh. The girls went out to splash in puddles, and May stood in the doorway, the light catching on her face. Elias stepped up beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him even in the cool morning. "You stood your ground last night," he said. "So did you." He gave a small nod, as if the matter was settled. But there was something in his eyes, something like respect layered over with something softer, that stayed with May long after. The threat from Martin Harper never came to blows. Maybe word got around that Elias Boone was not a man to push twice, or maybe Sam's sudden reappearance sent the right whispers down the trail. Either way, by the time autumn rolled in, the Boone place was still standing, fence mended, barn roof tight, and a new lock on the feed shed. The fever had gone as quickly as it came, leaving the girls thinner but stronger, their laughter brighter for having been tested. May felt it too, the shift that comes after you've kept watch through a long night and seen the dawn break anyway. Days fell into a rhythm that was theirs alone. May rising before the sun, her boots quiet on the porch boards, coffee percolating while the cottonwoods whispered against the sky. Elias in the yard, checking the animals, his silhouette cut against the pale light. The girls spilling into the kitchen in a tumble of braids and chatter, the smell of biscuits in the oven. Sam stayed longer than anyone expected. He kept to himself mostly, working the fence line, patching the smokehouse, teaching the twins how to throw a rope. May noticed the way the girls began to trust him in small, cautious increments, bringing him a cup of coffee without being asked, showing him their schoolwork in the evening. One Saturday, after chores were done, Elias saddled the wagon for a trip into El Dorado Creek. The whole family went, May in her best calico, the girls in freshly pressed dresses, Sam riding alongside on horseback. They traded eggs and preserves for sugar, flour, and bolts of cloth. May lingered at the stall selling seed packets, thinking ahead to the spring garden. It was there, amid the clamor of the market, that she realized something simple and steady. She belonged here. Not because she'd been hired, or because she'd been asked to stay, but because she had laid down roots, tended them, fought for them, and watched them grow. That night, back at the Boone place, the sky was thick with stars. Supper was a quiet affair, stew, cornbread, slices of late-season melon. After the dishes were washed and the younger girls tucked in, May and Elias sat on the porch, the lamplight spilling warm around them. "You ever think we'd get here?" she asked. Elias shook his head. Most days, I thought the trail would turn us under before we found a place to stop." She smiled. "But here we are." He nodded toward the cottonwoods. "Here we are." The wind moved through the leaves, carrying the smell of wood smoke and river water. May felt the weight of the months behind them, the storms, the sickness, the letters, the hard decisions. She also felt the strength they'd built together, piece by piece, like a fence line that could take a hit and still stand. Life Lesson 1. Staying is sometimes braver than leaving. Illustration. May could have walked away the day Sam's letter arrived. She had a reason, a place to go, and the history to justify it. But she stayed through storms and fevers and land disputes. Staying meant facing the unknown without running, and it gave the Boone girls the one thing they needed most: someone who didn't leave. Life Lesson 2. Trust is built in small moments, not grand gestures. Illustration. The girls didn't start calling May Mama after a single act. It came in steps: warm bread at supper, a steady hand during a storm, a night spent on the loft floor when the wind howled. Even Sam's redemption followed this rule. His help with the fence, his quiet presence with the children, built something words alone never could. Life Lesson 3. Fighting for a place makes it yours. Illustration. The Boone land wasn't truly May's on paper, but when Martin Harper threatened it, she defended it with the same grit as Elias. Planting the garden, keeping the books, improving the coop, these acts anchored her to the soil. It wasn't the legal deed that made it hers. It was the work and the will to keep it safe. Winter crept down from the hills in slow steps, frost on the troughs, smoke curling from the chimney before dawn. May sewed heavier curtains, lined the girls' boots with scraps of flannel, and taught them how to keep the fire banked through the night. Elias chopped more wood than they'd ever used before. Sam salted enough meat to last until spring. Christmas was simple: a goose roasted over the fire, molasses cookies, and each girl receiving one small gift. Ribbons, a new slate, a carved whistle. May's gift came at the end of the day, after the girls had gone to bed. Elias handed her a wooden box with a brass latch. Inside was a hand-carved spoon with her name etched into the handle, and beneath it, in smaller letters, the word family. She looked at him, unable to speak for a moment. He only tipped his hat, that quiet Boone way of saying what didn't need to be said. The year turned over without fuss. Snow came and went, the creek freezing in the shallow bends. By the first thaw, Sam announced he'd be moving on. May shook his hand on the porch, the girls waving from the yard. "You did right this time," she told him. He smiled, lines deep at the corners of his eyes. "Reckon I learned from watching you." When he rode away, May didn't feel the old ache of people leaving. She felt the satisfaction of knowing he'd carry something of this place with him, just as she carried it in her. By summer, the Boone place had grown again. 2 more rows in the garden, a calf in the pasture, and a new shelf in the pantry filled with jars of peaches. May moved through her days without the sense of waiting for the next hard turn. There would be more storms, more sickness, more tests, but she'd meet them as she had these, with both feet planted and her eyes steady. One evening, she stood by the fence at dusk, watching the girls chase each other in the tall grass, their laughter rising like the call of meadowlarks. Elias joined her, resting one arm on the top rail. "Looks like they're finally home," he said. May glanced at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. "So are we." The sun slid behind the hills, the cottonwoods whispering in the cooling air. The creek kept its song, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. May didn't flinch. This was their place, and whatever came down the trail next, they'd meet it together, just as they always had and always would. Well, partner, that's the end of today's trail. I tip my hat to you for riding along with us through dust, wind, and wide open skies. Out here on Cowboy Trail Stories, we'll keep telling you more true-hearted tales of the untamed West. Stories of grit, honor, and the kind of love that holds through any storm. Until we meet again down the trail, may your coffee stay hot, your boots stay steady, and your heart find peace under these endless western skies. Ride safe, friend. We'll be waiting for you.